Apologies first, I have a slight touch of a head cold, hopefully not avian flu, but if there's any interruptions, I apologise. There's a brief overview of the talk here. We're going to talk about a recap of the reintroduction in Scotland and how the populations are faring just now. Talk about a report that Scottish Natural Heritage did with RSPB as contractors, looking at both the future population and range modelling for the growth of the population, and some aspects of management and issues that are cropping up with the population. So for those of you who don't know about the Scottish reintroduction, there were a couple of independent attempts a number of years ago, but it was in the 1970s and early 80s that the first serious organised reintroduction programme started with birds from Norway. They came from the Bodo region with Harold Meesand involved. These birds were in Rum, that's one in the photo. These birds started to form a breeding population with the first breeding on Mull in 1985. But the birds struggled a little. Very few pairs actually bred successfully once they were establishing. So in the mid-1990s, we got some more birds from Norway to boost up the population with a second release. Finally, from 2007 to 2012, we tried to expand the range of the birds by bringing birds into the east of Scotland, releasing them in Fife with the help of Alf Otter and colleagues. Those birds are now establishing, having reached adult age. So the current population has, as I say, has been slow to establish, but we're now, the provisional figures for 2017 are that we have a minimum of 113 occupied territories and a minimum of 67 young fledged this year. So it is going up very fast since 2010. This has heightened fears amongst some of the agricultural sector, amongst others, and also the forestry sector. So we started looking at future range modelling and stuff in a report that I'll come on to, but it is the dominance of wild-bred birds being more productive than the released birds in the early years of the release that have boosted up the population. So in the West Coast, there are concentrations in Mull, Skye and the Outer Hebrides. That red line covers the bulk of the West Coast population. Between Mull, Skye and the Outer Hebrides, there are somewhere around 70 to 80 pairs, so it holds a real chunk of the population. There are blue dots on that map, which I hope you can see, are the approximate locations of scattered birds in the east and north of Scotland, where pairs are establishing. There are about 8 territories in those areas just now. These are very much outliers and scattered pairs. Some of the East Coast released birds decided to go west. Mainly females, I think it's 7 or 8 birds have settled mostly around Mull and Ardnamurchan. We've also pinched a couple of Allen's Irish birds. The population has been very well monitored since the early days. We had bespoke monitoring under contract with the RSPB from early on. But as the population has grown, it's become, unfortunately, too expensive to do that kind of monitoring forever. So we're now working to bring in more volunteers from the network of Scottish Raptor study groups and a number of other volunteers who've been working with their own sea eagles from when they first settled in those areas. We're also taking advantage of new technology. That figure is a satellite tracks from Owen, the East Scotland Sea Eagle Project Officer. It's a chick from Angus that was fledged a couple of years ago, I think. And it shows how it's, for a young eagle, Scotland is a very small country. But some of the clusters of activity there, the big one kind of toward the north, in the middle is on Speyside, where East Coast birds are starting to establish. So it's being, and then over into Mull on the west there, into the core population area. So this bird is going around visiting other sea eagles. So the future planning. We commissioned the RSPB in 2016 to model population growth for a look forward to 2025 and 2040. We also looked at trying to predict where birds would settle and how the population would expand geographically, which is a bit trickier. This was brought about by the fact the population was increasing quickly. We couldn't cover them quite as well as we could before in terms of monitoring, and a number of people in the farming sector particularly were lobbying the Scottish Government about the increasing population with their concerns about particularly lamb predation. So that lobbying has led to a national action plan for sea eagles being drafted. It's still not produced yet, but the report has been used to inform that. So the future population growth, it updated an earlier paper by Richard Evans and co. in 2009. We revised the demographic parameters to reflect the better breeding of the wild-bred birds, and the trajectory of the model route there, you can see in that top graph, much more closely fits the observed trajectory than we have, and the original prediction from Evans et al. Is in green, and it's not quite as good. So the prediction is we'll have over 200 pairs by 2025, and we look on track to do that. The longer term predictions up to 2040 suggested we could have as many as 1,000 pairs in Scotland, which is a bit of a scary figure for a lot of people. But we also looked at, we don't know what the carrying capacity of Scotland is for sea eagles, so we effectively capped the population model to simulate that by saying the population could be 2,000 birds, 3,000 birds, 4,000 birds, and they gave us another range of estimates. But it's the 500 to 800 pairs, so there's scope for a lot more birds in Scotland than we currently have. The distribution modelling was a bit more tricky. It's less good. Because of the detailed monitoring and demographics we had for the population, that was more straightforward to do. This is trickier. We based it on known dispersal distances, densities of birds, and the habitat associations we have for the existing birds in the population. It only predicts reasonably well, because even when we did this work, there were birds on Orkney, the islands at the north, and none of the model predictions predicted to be birds on Orkney. So it's a good guide, though. It is influenced a lot by pioneering pairs. We now have scope that we have more young birds roaming across Scotland with birds in the east as well, that pioneering pairs can appear well outside the current core ranges, and they could potentially form a cluster of birds in the future, so that can really influence the geographic distribution. So on to some of the aspects of management. As I've mentioned already, the farming community haven't always, or all of them haven't welcomed sea eagles. It's been from the early days. There have been 2 previous studies in Scotland, the one on Mull in the early 2000s and another in Gairloch in 2009, 2010. Both of these showed that most lambs were scavenged, but there was some live lamb predation. We have developed a management scheme previously on the back of the Mull report, which looked at implementing measures to try and improve lamb health, because there was a suggestion that some of the lambs that were being taken weren't in the best of health, so the ones that were taking live. So there was measures around that, and also some positive measures to try and attract sea eagles into other areas, etc., and to do some more positive actions around them. However, the concerns have remained. So in 2014, as I mentioned, the National Farmers Union have been lobbying the Scottish Government. So we're drafting this new action plan. We have a national stakeholder group involving some of the agricultural sector, also the forestry sector. So it is focusing on deterring livestock predation and trying new and interesting ways to improve the management scheme, as well as looking at some other issues to do with forestry management. It is much more collaborative. This group has, to a large extent, taken the tension out of a lot of the agricultural conflict. It is still not straightforward, though, but it is, things are less extreme than they were. In terms of forestry, I should have said actually, Rian, the talk that follows me, will cover our current scheme in more detail. In terms of forestry, it's always been a more collaborative approach. A significant proportion of our birds nest in commercial forestry. A lot of the commercial forestry in the west of Scotland is of a similar age, so large areas are currently at felling stage. So these large areas of forest are being felled and restructured and replanted. So there's a lot of management around white-tailed eagles there. Other things that have cropped up with forestry recently are that, one, the Scottish Government has a forestry expansion target and a bid to get more money out of the forestry industry. So that's one thing we have to be mindful of. But we've also had things like a number of notifiable tree diseases in commercial conifers, dothostoma in Scots pine and Phytophthora ramorum in larch trees. The surveillance for these is often aerial, and the management involves felling, and a lot of that sometimes has to be done at very sensitive periods of the year for birds in the early breeding season. So there's a lot of careful management around some of these cases, and we've had to do some licensed tree removal close to nests with lots of monitoring, etc. Wind farms, they're an issue for the bird in various parts of their range. In Scotland, there are concerns about this. To date, we've managed to steer the worst wind farms away from core sea eagle areas. At the moment, we're only aware of 2 collisions. There have probably been more, but there isn't monitoring at all wind farms in Scotland to know whether that is happening. Lost my thread. We haven't completely avoided wind farm potential impacts on sea eagles. There are some wind farms in here, and of course, as the population expands, they will move into areas that have a lot more wind farms in them and wind turbines. So another thing we looked at in the report was modelling additional mortality to see how robust the population was to that, and you can see from that graph that even at 14 individuals a year, it still doesn't put the population into decline, but it will significantly depress what the potential figure could be, population level could be. Similarly, with illegal persecution, it's been very rare in the West to date, despite the conflict with sheep farming industry in particular. In the East, we think there's been a bit more of that. It's into an area with intensive grouse moor management, which has a history of raptor persecution, and some of our birds have gone missing in areas which have recently been reviewed by the Scottish Government in terms of missing satellite tagged golden eagles, with the suspicion that they have all been illegally killed. So we're just a little bit worried about that, but again, we know the population is reasonably robust to additional mortality. Another thing that is flagged up to us quite often is sea eagles are going to chase away the golden eagles. This doesn't appear to be happening. We're seeing lots of interaction with quite a lot of aggressive encounters noted, but we had a national eagle survey in 2003, a national eagle survey in 2015. In 2015, our golden eagle population increased to just over 500 pairs. The areas in sort of Mull Sky and Outer Hebrides, where I've said the core of the sea eagle population is in these areas also have very high densities, possibly the highest densities in Europe of golden eagle, with about 150 pairs across those areas. So we're not seeing ousting of birds to any great extent. Some interference with nesting success, perhaps. And I'd like to end on a poignant note. Many of you in the audience will know Richard Evans or have seen his papers. He was a stalwart of the reintroduction in Scotland. Sadly, he died very suddenly last year, actually before we published the paper, the report in 2016. He was one of the authors. And his vast knowledge and experience is sadly missed by everyone still working on white-tailed eagles in Scotland. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So, questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned the possibility of predation on live lambs, and you mentioned something about perhaps they were not in good shape. Was there any evidence from post-mortem analysis or anything like that to strengthen that, or what?
Yes, there has been. Yeah, a lot of a sample of the lambs have been post-mortems. Quite a few of them have background health issues. Yes, the eagles are taking some live lambs, and we've had some direct observation, although quite rarely.
Can you specify what this means some? 5%, 10%, 1%? It's very important because local people tell about damage for them. So what we can tell them in this case? The 50% of your lambs will be eaten by this eagle or something other?
Yeah, this is one of the ongoing debates we have with the farmers as to how many lambs are taken live. We also have an issue with the way sheep are farmed in some of the hill areas of Scotland. They are fairly extensively managed, so they have losses to other reasons. And sometimes eagles are blamed for everything, but in terms of proving actual eagle predation, it is quite difficult. Even when we have veterinary information or photographs, etc., we can only say it, in some cases it's been killed by an eagle, but it may have been a golden eagle. But it is generally small numbers for some people, but the study on mull showed that it could be a problem at an individual holding level, a farm level for people.
Okay, one question if we have. I guess there's no questions. Thank you.